What if the tiny island nation of Singapore has more power over China's future than most of the world realizes? It sounds impossible. Singapore is smaller than the city of New York. It has no army the size of its giant neighbors, no oil, no vast farmland, nothing except its people and its position on the map. And yet, when you look closely at how China behaves around Singapore, you see something strange. Caution. Respect. Careful diplomacy. Not fear in the dramatic sense, but a deep, calculated wariness. Beijing does not push Singapore around the way it pushes around other small nations. It negotiates. It listens. It studies. In this video, we are going to break down 10 real reasons why China treats Singapore like a puzzle it has never fully solved, a neighbor it cannot dominate, and a mirror it cannot look away from. Stay with me, because point number 7 might completely change how you see Southeast Asia. Point 1. Singapore sits on the world's most important shipping lane. Picture a narrow stretch of water squeezed between Malaysia and Indonesia, barely wide enough in some places for two massive ships to pass safely. This is the Strait of Malacca, and it is one of the busiest and most important waterways on planet Earth. Roughly a quarter of all global trade passes through this strait every single year, and for China, the numbers are even more staggering. The vast majority of China's oil imports, the fuel that keeps its factories running and its cities lit, travels through this exact passage. Now here is the part that matters. Singapore sits right at the mouth of this strait, like a gatekeeper watching everything that comes and goes. Whoever controls or influences activity near this choke point holds enormous leverage over global trade, and especially over China's energy security. Chinese military strategists have openly discussed something called the Malacca Dilemma, the uncomfortable reality that China's economy could be strangled if this passage were ever blocked or heavily monitored by unfriendly forces. Singapore does not own the strait, but its ports, its naval cooperation with other countries, and its central location make it one of the most important watchers of that waterway. China cannot ignore a country sitting on the very artery that feeds its economy. This alone forces Beijing to treat Singapore with far more seriousness than its size would ever suggest. A nation that controls information and access to this choke point is a nation China must always keep close, and always keep guessing about. Point 2. Singapore has deep and active military ties with the United States. Here is something many people do not realize. Even though Singapore is a majority ethnic Chinese nation, its closest security partner is not China. It is the United States. American warships regularly dock and refuel at Singapore's naval bases. American surveillance aircraft use Singaporean facilities to patrol the region. Singapore has hosted rotational deployments of advanced American military hardware for years, allowing the United States to project power deep into Southeast Asia without needing a formal base on Singaporean soil. This is not a small detail. It means that right next to China's southern trade route sits a nation that actively enables American military presence in the region. For a country like China, which sees American influence in Asia as a direct challenge to its own rise, having Singapore function as a friendly host for the American Navy is deeply significant. It is not an alliance in the traditional sense, Singapore is careful never to call it that, but the level of cooperation runs deep enough that Chinese defense planners must factor Singapore into every regional calculation they make. When tensions rise between Washington and Beijing, all eyes quietly turn to what Singapore will allow, permit, or quietly enable. That kind of quiet influence is exactly the kind of thing that keeps Chinese strategists up at night, because Singapore never fully commits to either side, and uncertainty is far more unsettling than open hostility. Point 3. Singapore refuses to fully align with either superpower. Most small nations eventually pick a side. They lean toward Washington, or they lean toward Beijing, because the pressure to choose becomes overwhelming. Singapore has spent decades refusing to do this, and it has done so successfully. Singaporean leaders have said publicly, many times, that their nation will not be forced into an exclusive camp. They trade heavily with China. In fact, China is one of Singapore's largest trading partners, while simultaneously deepening security ties with the United States and other Western nations. This balancing act, often called hedging by political scientists, is incredibly difficult to pull off, and Singapore has mastered it better than almost any other country on Earth. For China, this is both frustrating and impressive. Frustrating because Beijing cannot simply buy loyalty through trade deals and investment the way it often can elsewhere. Impressive because Singapore's economy and diplomatic standing remain strong precisely because it refuses to be predictable. China would prefer a neighbor that leans clearly one way, because that makes long-term planning easier. Instead, Singapore keeps its options open, keeps its relationships diverse, and keeps Beijing constantly reassessing where the line actually is. A country that cannot be easily predicted or pressured is a country that commands attention, and Singapore has built its entire foreign policy identity around being exactly that kind of unpredictable, stable, and quietly powerful actor in the region. Point 4. Singapore hosts the most sensitive diplomatic meetings in Asia. Think about where major powers choose to meet when tensions are highest and trust is lowest. Time and time again, the answer has been Singapore. The Shangri-La Dialogue, the region's most important security summit, happens in Singapore every year, bringing together defense ministers, generals, and top officials from China, the United States, and dozens of other nations to discuss the most sensitive security issues in Asia. Singapore has also hosted historic diplomatic breakthroughs, including a landmark summit between an American president and the leader of North Korea. Why does this matter for China? Because a nation trusted enough to host these conversations gains enormous soft power and influence over the tone and direction of regional dialogue. Singapore is seen as neutral ground, a place where rivals can speak without feeling like they are walking into enemy territory. This neutrality is not an accident, it is the result of decades of careful diplomacy, and it gives Singapore a seat at the table during conversations that shape the entire region's future, including conversations about China's own military posture and territorial ambitions. China would prefer these conversations happen on its own terms, in venues it can better control or influence. Instead, they often happen on Singaporean soil, under Singaporean rules, with Singaporean officials setting the tone. That kind of quiet convening power is not something China can easily replicate, and it is not something Beijing can afford to dismiss. Point 5. China cannot assume Singapore will act like a loyal overseas Chinese community. Around 3/4 of Singapore's population is ethnically Chinese, and for decades, some observers in Beijing assumed this shared heritage would naturally translate into political closeness or loyalty. This assumption has proven wrong again and again. Singaporean leaders have been remarkably firm and consistent in stating that Singapore is a sovereign nation with its own national interests, not an extension of Chinese identity or Chinese foreign policy. Singapore's founding leadership deliberately built a multicultural national identity, blending Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other communities, precisely to avoid being seen as simply a Chinese outpost in Southeast Asia. When Chinese state media or officials have occasionally implied that overseas Chinese communities should feel a natural pull toward supporting China's positions, Singaporean leaders have pushed back firmly and publicly. This matters enormously for China's broader strategy in the region. Beijing often hopes that shared ethnicity and cultural ties can translate into political sympathy or influence, a strategy it has used with varying success elsewhere. Singapore represents the clearest example of a nation refusing to let ethnic identity dictate its geopolitical choices. This refusal sends a powerful message to other overseas Chinese communities around the world, and it denies China an easy pathway to influence that it might otherwise have expected. A country that cannot be won over through cultural kinship alone is a country that requires far more careful, far more respectful, and far more calculated engagement. Point 6. Singapore has quietly supported international rules over South China Sea claims. The South China Sea is one of the most contested waters on Earth, with China claiming vast stretches of territory that overlap with the claims of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and others. Singapore does not have a direct territorial claim in this dispute, but it has consistently spoken up in favor of resolving these disputes through international law, particularly the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This might sound like a small diplomatic detail, but it carries real weight. When a respected, economically successful, and diplomatically careful nation like Singapore repeatedly emphasizes the importance of international legal frameworks rather than raw power in resolving these disputes, it subtly reinforces the position of China's rivals in the dispute. Singapore has also consistently supported freedom of navigation, the principle that international waters should remain open to all nations for trade and travel, a principle that indirectly pushes back against some of China's more expansive maritime claims. China has, at times, expressed displeasure when Singaporean officials have made statements seen as leaning toward this international law-based approach. Yet Singapore has not backed down from this position, choosing instead to maintain what it sees as a principled and consistent stance rather than bending to pressure. For China, this means that even a small trading partner it needs and values is willing to publicly hold a position that complicates Beijing's preferred narrative in one of the most sensitive territorial disputes in the modern world. Point 7. Singapore built a financial and trade hub that rivals China's own cities. For decades, Hong Kong stood as Asia's undisputed financial capital, a bridge between China and the rest of the world. But as political and economic conditions in Hong Kong shifted, many international businesses, banks, and wealthy individuals began looking for alternatives, and Singapore became the biggest beneficiary of that shift. Massive amounts of capital, entire regional headquarters of global companies, and enormous private wealth have flowed into Singapore in recent years. This is not just an economic story, it is a strategic one. Singapore now stands as a genuine rival hub for finance, trade, and business in Asia, one that operates under a stable legal system, low corruption, and strong international trust, without being under direct Chinese political control. For China, watching a nearby city-state absorb so much of the capital and business activity that might otherwise flow through Chinese-controlled financial centers is a significant concern. It represents competition, but also a kind of quiet statement to the world, that there is a stable, prosperous, globally connected alternative in Asia that operates independently of Beijing's political system. Singapore's continued rise as a financial powerhouse is a constant reminder that success in the region does not have to run through China, and that is a narrative Beijing has to carefully manage every single day. Point 8. Singapore maintains military training ties with Taiwan. This point often surprises people, but it has been true for a very long time. Since the 1970s, Singapore has maintained a military training arrangement with Taiwan, often referred to by its codename, allowing Singaporean armed forces to conduct training exercises on Taiwanese soil, something Singapore's own limited land area makes difficult to do at home. China considers Taiwan a breakaway province and views any nation's military cooperation with Taiwan as an extremely sensitive issue, often protesting loudly when other countries engage in similar arrangements. Yet this training relationship between Singapore and Taiwan has continued for decades, even as Singapore has simultaneously built a strong economic relationship with mainland China and does not recognize Taiwan as an independent state diplomatically. This delicate balancing act, maintaining practical military cooperation with Taiwan while officially adhering to a one China policy in its diplomatic relations, shows just how skillfully Singapore navigates the most sensitive fault lines in the region. China has occasionally expressed displeasure about this arrangement, but has largely tolerated it, likely because pushing too hard risks damaging the broader economic and diplomatic relationship it values with Singapore. Still, the mere fact that this arrangement persists, decade after decade, right under Beijing's watchful eye, is a quiet demonstration that Singapore will not simply abandon relationships it considers important, even when China would clearly prefer otherwise. Point 9. Singapore shapes consensus across the entire Southeast Asian region. Singapore is a founding member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, commonly known as ASEAN, a group of 10 countries that collectively represent a massive population and a rapidly growing economic bloc. While Singapore is one of the smallest nations in the group by land area, it is consistently one of the most influential voices in shaping ASEAN's collective positions, thanks to its economic strength, diplomatic skill, and reputation for careful, principled leadership. When ASEAN nations debate how to respond to Chinese actions in the region, whether related to trade, territorial disputes, or infrastructure investment, Singapore's voice often carries disproportionate weight in shaping the eventual consensus. China has spent enormous resources trying to build influence across individual ASEAN nations, using investment, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic outreach. Yet Singapore's consistent emphasis on multilateral cooperation, rule of law, and balanced engagement with all major powers acts as a kind of counterweight, encouraging other ASEAN members to avoid becoming too dependent on or aligned with any single power, including China. This regional influence means that Singapore's choices ripple far beyond its own small borders, shaping how an entire bloc of nations positions itself relative to Beijing, and that kind of amplified influence is exactly the sort of soft power that keeps Chinese diplomats working overtime. Point 10. China has studied Singapore's governance model for decades. Perhaps the most fascinating point of all is this. Chinese leaders, including the architect of China's modern economic reforms, openly admired and studied Singapore's model of governance, its blend of a strong, centralized government with a market-driven, internationally open economy. Thousands of Chinese officials have traveled to Singapore over the decades for training programs designed specifically to study how Singapore achieved rapid economic development, low corruption, and social stability all at once. In many ways, Singapore became a kind of laboratory that Chinese leadership looked to for lessons on how to modernize without losing political control. This is a strange and complicated form of respect. China does not simply dismiss Singapore as a small, insignificant nation, it has spent enormous effort trying to understand and even replicate certain elements of what Singapore built. Yet Singapore has also evolved its own distinct political culture, one that includes more space for opposition voices, media scrutiny, and international engagement than mainland China allows. This means China admires the results Singapore achieved, while remaining wary of fully adopting the openness that helped produce those results. That tension, wanting the success without fully embracing the openness behind it, keeps Singapore as a constant point of reference, comparison, and quiet unease for Chinese policymakers who know that a small island nation solved problems China itself is still wrestling with today. So there you have it, 10 real and fascinating reasons why China treats Singapore with a level of caution and respect that its small size would never suggest. It is not fear in the dramatic movie sense, it is something more interesting, a mix of strategic necessity, quiet competition, and grudging admiration for a nation that built extraordinary success while refusing to be pushed around by anyone. Singapore's story proves that size is not the only measure of influence in this world, sometimes location, diplomacy, and discipline matter just as much, if not more. If this video opened your eyes to a side of Asian geopolitics you never knew about, do not scroll away just yet. Hit that like button so more people can discover this story, drop a comment below telling me which point surprised you the most, and if you want more deep dives into the hidden power plays shaping our world today, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.